The following discussion is for religious and educational purposes only. Nothing you hear on this podcast is medical advice or an encouragement to use any substance outside a lawful religious or medical setting. This podcast does not provide or facilitate access to any sacrament. And with that out of the way, let's take it to the Hearthcast.
Welcome to the Hearthcast, where science meets the sacred.
From psychedelics in the brain to the mycelial networks beneath our feet, we talk about the threads that weave us together. We're your hosts. I'm Kelsey.
And this is Jessa. Thanks for joining us, fellow Earthlings.
For those who are just getting to know us, we are leaders of a religious organization called Entheo Church. You'll hear us use the words sacrament, entheogen, and psychedelic somewhat interchangeably. That's because in our faith, they point to the same thing, sacred tools for connection and understanding.
Today, we're talking about how to have a good trip, which is set and setting. We'll dive into a little bit about what that means, and also from a scientific and a spiritual perspective. This is one, Kelsey, that you brought up that you really wanted to dive into when we were talking about, okay, what are the topics we want to cover first? Yeah. Why is this one so important to you?
I think it's so important because there's been this people are buzzing about the psychedelic renaissance, right? This idea that, oh, psychedelics are hip now, they're cool, like everybody wants to use them for their depression or PTSD or just wellness, like they've exploded back onto the scene. And as a result, I've gotten a ton of people who are interested in talking to me about it because they know that this is a passion project of mine. And at the same time, people kind of think of psychedelics as a drug. And most drugs that people have experience with, you can take daily, you can just take regularly, and they supposedly make your life better, right? Like that's how it works. Psychedelics, you have to be really mindful of. Many people also know of that one person or a few people in their lives who took psychedelics in a context that wasn't particularly kind to them and they had a bad trip. So we talk about this, like what's a bad trip? How does somebody have a bad trip? How do you reduce the risk of having a bad trip? So that's really why I felt like this had to be one of the very first things we talk about. Just from a harm reduction standpoint, I want to make sure that people feel really supported. And if you decide that you want to take psychedelics in a party setting where you don't know very many people, I think that that's a risk. I really wouldn't recommend doing it.
Absolutely. And I think part of why that's the case is a term I've heard you use quite a bit, and I'd love for you to dive into a bit about it and what it means, this non-specific amplifier.
Yeah. So this term was coined by, I believe it was Stanislav Grof. And the idea that psychedelics are a non-specific amplifier means that these substances don't necessarily create specific experiences. They're very hard to predict. Instead, what they do is they amplify what's already present in the psyche and the environment. There's some discussion about how accurate that is because people who clearly have a very negative space in their psyche, people who are severely depressed, for example, we're starting to see some research that suggests that they, in fact, can benefit positively from psychedelic treatment. So, that I don't know whether non-specific amplifier is the perfect term, but it's certainly, I think, a pretty good, effective one to explain why this is important. So, whatever is in your mind or your surroundings, your emotions, your relationships, your stress level, and what your intentions are, that can ultimately inform your trip and become more influential over your trip. There's been studies that have been coming out about, for example, MDMA and PTSD research. And many people think of MDMA as the party drug that's used in the rave scene, right? Mm-hmm. But there's been this push to really study it for PTSD. And it seems to be very important that somebody enters that kind of experience with the intention to face some of the trauma that they've experienced. You may not get that experience in a rave. You might not work through if you're struggling with PTSD, right? You're not going to work through your PTSD in a rave setting. So the setting is really important. And the set is also part of the background. So even having the intention to work through PTSD is the set, right? So those two things together, your environment, your setting, and your mindset, your set, determine that quality, tone, and the direction of your entire experience.
Absolutely. And I think that's, if we're going to talk about this is the new psychedelic renaissance that we're living in, I think the the main difference that we're seeing is this focus on integration or intentionality behind, like, it's not just taking the sacrament or working with it as a tool. It's also you've got preparation time leading up to it where here's what I want to work on, here's what I'm thinking about. You have the experience itself, and then it's all the integration work afterwards.
Yeah, it's so interesting because this has been going on in, the underground or in indigenous communities with their own specific sacraments. This has been going on for a very long time. And now in our own Western science framework, we're seeing the attempts to kind of replicate this model, but the FDA has no idea how to do it because
Exactly.
they've never, yeah, I mean, like they don't, that's not their job, right? Like they have always been just trying to make sure, okay, is the drug safe? Is it being manufactured safely? Are all the claims on the packaging actually what this is used to treat? Like that's what they know how to do. They don't know how to regulate like therapy. They don't know how to say like, oh, is this protocol, this therapeutic protocol with this drug working as intended? It's really interesting. You see them grappling with it in their filings. They're like,
Well, and especially even from like a spiritual and religious context, because this is something that we've done since, as long as there's been history and before interacting with sacrament in a
mm-hmm.
spiritual context, a lot of that knowledge has been lost. There are efforts to regain it, but it's like, how do you test it? Because how they know how to test something is, okay, you're hooking people up to wires to check their heart rate. You've got people in lab coats that are staring at somebody trying to see how this is impacting them. And that is exactly a thing that will likely set them on a bad trip or experience.
Well, it's interesting because, yes, I've thought that too. And like I've visited there's a dosing room at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I think I told you about this when I saw it, but
Yeah.
I walked into this room and like, bless their heart, they have tried, like they worked so hard. They were one of the first, like I am not throwing shade at UW-Madison. They are amazing. And they've actually seen some really positive results from the work that they've done. But I personally walked into that room and I was like, oh my God, there's no windows.
I want to go touch grass and be
I was like,
outside.
I need to run out immediately. And it's interesting. There's like one study that I read. It was years ago, so I'd have to find it again. But I read it, and it was like this one person escaped from a research study. They had like dosed them. I think it was with psilocybin. And they were writing this. They wrote it pretty clinically because it's a research study. But they talked about this one person who dropped out of the study by having someone come and pick them up, and they left. And they were just like currently in an altered state. And I was sitting here just being like, I mean, one, I get it. But also like, I was so disappointed in that research study because like that would have been such a beautiful area for a qualitative survey follow-up with that person to say like, why did you feel the need to leave? Because I can tell you that, and now we're kind of getting into like the spiritual thing for me, not being able to touch grass. It's just like that would be so hard for me if they could have potentially started to find what I personally think their research is going to ultimately show is that there is so much benefit to nature settings.
Yes.
And we're actually kind of seeing this with Cody Wenther was one of my professors, and he was doing this study, the Poesis study, which I just absolutely love. And it's starting to show that people are preferring like nature scenes. And he's trying to kind of parse the cultural differences because a lot of people that these studies have been done on are new agey white people. All these studies have oftentimes been done on those people. So like this study was trying to parse like cultural differences and preferences so that, you're providing culturally competent care in these psychedelic experiences. And what they're ultimately finding is that doesn't matter. I mean, there are cultural differences, except when it comes to like nature scenes. People love nature. This makes sense. It's embedded into our biology, right? Like people, the biophilia hypothesis is this hypothesis that people love, alive things. Oh, what a surprise. Like evolutionarily, we like things that are alive. It means that we have an ecosystem that's thriving and healthy and safe for us, right? But I don't know where I was going with that. I just love that study.
Just so you know, this is how many of our conversations end up going. She just gets off on a tangent about a study she read. I love it. So I would like to dive into suggestibility and
Yeah.
neuroplasticity and how it fits into set and setting.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why set and setting is so important is because when you enter one of these altered states, you're really entering a very suggestible place. The theory behind how psychedelics, one of the ways that psychedelics enact their therapeutic potential and just in general how they work on the brain is that they can temporarily increase neuroplasticity.
Hmm.
So they can kind of reopen these critical windows. You do developmentally go through critical windows as a child. This is part of development. The brain's ability to form and reorganize connections becomes more potent. And that's really what happens with psychedelics. So if you can change your mind, Michael Pollan's book, right? If you can use psychedelics for learning and habit change and perspective shifts, and your brain is this like heightened neuroplastic soup of imprintability, right? You're more open to suggestion and influence. And that can be really great if you put yourself into a context that can hold you and help you form connections that are going to be more beneficial to your brain. That can also be really dangerous. And this is part of like vulnerability and why it's important to put yourself into safe situations and really be thoughtful about how you do this, because what's present during that window in terms of, safety and support and thoughtfulness about how you are going to approach your life after you have these this ability to change your brain, that's going to be so important for what ultimately when your soup brain hardens back into its rigid form, you want to make sure that you've done the work in a way that's really beneficial to you. And that's why set and setting is so important, right? And we've seen this negatively affect people, right? Like the United States government did this terrible experimentation in MK Ultra and tortured people while on psychedelics, like people out of their mind on LSD, just getting recordings about how they're a terrible person, right? Like you can seriously damage yourself. I mean, obviously don't do that to yourself, but this is why it's so important. You can have beautiful work and change, but you also can really harm yourself. You can harm other people. You really need to make sure that you're approaching this in a responsible way.
Because that makes me think, you're going to laugh at this, makes me think of a crab that shed its shell. Ecdysis, if we're going to get in a little bit of nerdy biology.
Okay.
Here, because when a crab sheds itself, because it has that harder, it's almost like you think of like our various growth stages or like those windows that you're talking about with brain development. When the crab sheds its shell, it's got this limited time of growth where it takes what it's reserved, what it's been working on, and it is only able to grow because it's exoskeleton, it's outside.
It's free.
It's free, but it's also tender.
And very scrumptious to a seagull, I am sure.
And vulnerable. Like,
Yes.
that's the thing, is it is vulnerable. And that is why it is so important to be in good settings and in a spot where you're safe, because you can be more suggestible during this time and more able to be controlled or manipulated.
You know what, Jessa? I liked that story.
Okay, well, there we go. So it's not just, but the crab will hide during that time. And I think it's important, especially after having a larger dose or an intense psychedelic experience, to take that integration time before you just go back to your day-to-day or anything else, just to sit with it.
Yeah.
Because that is a period of rapid expansion and growth of understanding, but it is also a time where you're tender.
Yeah. And understanding which sacrament you're working with and what that neuroplastic window looks like is also pretty important. They can have different lengths of time. And it seems like research is showing, I think right now, that it corresponds relatively closely with the duration of the trip for how long the neuroplastic window is. Although I need to look at that. I want to caveat that because, DMT is a relatively short trip, and I don't know if that one follows that pattern. I know that with like ketamine, it's a pretty short window.
But, okay, so if it's DMT itself, like if you're just vaping and inhaling it, like that is an incredibly short experience.
Yeah.
But if you do have an MAOI or something like that that is making the experience last longer, then, I know after my ayahuasca experience, it was about 3 days that I was just more tender and needed to be present with myself and just really sit with that time.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've seen the research with psilocybin, and it's still showing positive improvements, 3 months after the acute experience. And so they're still trying to kind of parse this out for different different psychedelics, but the neuroplastic window, it can vary, and kind of understanding that and being gentle with yourself, and mindful of who you're surrounding yourself with is going to be a really important aspect to that.
Absolutely. And so before we dive more into that chemistry, I'd like us to understand the container that gives it shape. So do you want to dive into the mindset and internal state a little bit?
Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about container, because I feel like that's a word that a lot of people don't
Mm,
necessarily use regularly. We've talked about it, but why
okay.
don't you tell me what you mean by container, Jessa?
For me, the container is the space in which you're holding that ceremony. It's the sacrament itself, where you're having it, what your mindset is or intention during that time, who's there with you, what support network do you have. Those are some of the things I think of when I think of container. It's like you're setting the stage.
I kind of like to think of it like the placebo. I think that that's the great thing about these non-specific amplifiers is like we tried in Western medicine. I just love that psychedelics break the Western medicine framework. I think it's just fantastic. Stay humble, my friends. Scientists, stay humble. It's just constant learning. I love it. Yeah, they're non-specific amplifiers, right?
Mhm.
And so if they amplify your placebo settings, where you're involved, like what your mindset is, where you're at, they can be incredibly hard to parse from placebo. And I think that that's what's so fascinating. But we can start with mindset. That's
Mhm.
just your internal psychological and emotional state. So you'll see that in traditional settings, a lot of people also consider this with like, I think you fasted, or did you
Mhm.
fast, or did you just do a specific diet before you did your Aya?
So I definitely went more intense with
Yeah.
mine than most people do. Depending on the tradition. For some, it's a week or two before. For some, it's 3 or so days before. I did because it coincided with the eclipses. I'm like, I'm just going to take this season, this little portal, and really just remove everything that's a distraction.
Hmm.
So that means cheese, because cheese contains narcotics.
Cheese contains narcotics.
It's look into that.
All right.
It's yes.
What kind of cheese? Where do I get it?
All cheese. That's why cheese is so addictive and delicious.
Okay.
Cheese is sacrament.
We're
I
going to fact
stand.
check that one, friends.
And so check out the Substack, because you will see that I am right.
Okay.
The science. No, but so it was you eat a very bland diet, and also understanding, the guidance that legal ayahuasca churches have gotten is that you don't want to have anything that's fermented, because it can have some bad interactions. So it's like removing
Hmm.
anything out of my diet so I ate very plain. I was fully sober. That includes not eating an edible gummy to help me fall asleep at night, which I had become quite addicted to. Also physical. Like, so I was completely celibate. So all of those things, like any of the distractions or things that like sugar, caffeine, all of those I just removed,
Yeah.
because I just really wanted this time to be like an intentional, prayerful time of going into this with respect, but also because I was setting the intention of I've lived a life that I'm happy with up until this point, but how good could it be? So if I want
Yeah.
things to change, I need to change things. So how do I see things differently? And so I took it much more serious than the average person would have.
Yeah, and I think that this goes to intention, right? Like you want to make sure that your intentions are aligning with what you're trying to accomplish here. If you don't do that, you're just you might still have a good experience. It's just that it's much less predictable,
Hmm.
right? And these are just things that you can do to actually make sure that you're creating the best possible outcome for yourself. You talked a little bit about removing unnecessary stimuli and kind of like focusing on your current emotional state before you went in. That's really helpful for being able to stabilize your mood. Having a few tools in your arsenal for breathing
Hmm.
exercises. Breath is a really, really good grounding a grounding practice. So if you're getting into, anxious states during the experience, you can then go back to your breath. And it's a really good grounding exercise. So that journaling, if you have a therapist that you feel like you can talk to about this, that's always great. Obviously, it can be a little hit or miss. It's just therapy is as good as the therapist. So
Hmm.
making sure that you have a good relationship with your therapist and a good alliance with them can be super helpful if you have that. But during the acute experience, I definitely recommend being able to have some sort of breath work that you can feel comforted by, that can bring you back into your body. And then, there's the whole psychological preparation of that. Have you confronted, are you aware of what your fears actually are, what you might actually face during an acute experience? Have you spent some time self-reflecting, making sure that you understand what you're trying to gain? Not all of this is necessarily going to come up. You may actually end up having a very joyful experience.
Right.
It doesn't have to always go back to like this deep self-reflection type thing. I think there's a lot of flavors of a sacramental journey, but these things can set you up well to be in a good place. And then also just going into any psychedelic experience, understanding what you might expect. So what are the effects? What's the duration? What dosage are you planning to take? Have you looked into any contraindications that might be a risk factor for you? Make sure you understand the supplements that you are currently.
Translate. What is a counterindication?
A contraindication. Yeah. A contraindication. So something that should not be used in conjunction or may have interactions with it. So I go back to this one because it's just one of the most common. SSRIs very well they also affect the serotonin system. So many psychedelics interact in the serotonin system. So if you are taking SSRIs, you may experience differences in your trip than other people. Oftentimes, this is a dulled version, but that can make dosing a challenging thing to figure out. It's not very clear exactly how much to take in those settings. I think you'd want to work with your therapist, your psychiatrist, if you were planning on doing something like this, and definitely do not taper off of any psychiatric medication without an actual trained medical doctor doing that with you. I cannot emphasize that enough. There's been certainly a lot of hype around psychedelics, and people will sometimes taper off of their medication, and that can be incredibly dangerous if you're not doing it supervised medically. There's other contraindications as well, but there's a whole list, and I'm not going to go into it. It's basically just things that can impact your journey, your trip, the pharmacokinetics of the drug in your body, how it interacts with the body.
Is there anything else you want to jump on set before jumping into setting?
I think the only other thing that I would say is whatever you're going to be engaging with, I think it can be helpful to kind of look into the cultural context that whatever it is that you're using comes from. I think that when we have an appreciation of the place that things originated, it can really inform kind of at least respect and appreciation for what you're taking. And that's not to say like co-opt it. I think that it's important to understand that like your own background is different than where the ceremonial context that a lot of these things originated from. But I think that there are lessons to be learned from these other traditions. And so, keep a curious mind. That's more just, my own personal recommendation. I think that respecting these compounds is just part of our own spiritual practice. That's more of an Entheo church like important thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good part of the reason why we found each other and are building what we're doing. To be able to do that.
When you respect the sacrament, the sacrament respects you. That's kind of my opinion there.
It's an honoring and an appreciation, and gratitude is key.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the external environment.
Yeah.
Because we know the physical, social, and ritual environment shapes the safety and depth of the experience.
Yeah.
So let's talk about physical space.
Oh,
what are some of the things? I know we talked about touching grass.
Make sure there's a window. I mean, yeah, like I think that you want to make sure it's a balance, right? Like you want to make sure you're safe. Like I love being outside, but I'm not necessarily going to be, like the guys in the 70s that were hanging off of El Capitan on acid. Like
right?
I personally think like that's from my risk tolerance. That's not particularly the right setting, but I love that they were outside. I love that they were experiencing, the beauty and wonder of the natural world. I think that there can be a balance here where you're providing yourself a safe environment. If you're going to potentially be consuming outside, like make sure that you're in a place where you're not going to interact with a bunch of people. Make sure that you're not next to a cliff. Make sure that you have communicated that you're not and promised yourself that you're not going to play with the scorpions, that you have, you have a jacket, you have all the things that can keep you comfortable in an outside environment. And if you're going to be inside, like same thing, you want to have blankets, pillows, a nice comfortable space. Make sure that you have nice soft lighting. Don't do the whole like aggressive fluorescent light situation. Like that's oppressive. You are going to be incredibly sensitive to your sensory inputs.
Yes.
If you are tripping on a serotonergic psychedelic. So you definitely want to make sure that, things are clean, the dishes are clean. If you're at home, you're going to become sensitive to your environment. So be nice to yourself. Be thoughtful about where you're going to be. Make sure you have access to water. Make sure you have access to a restroom. If you need to have if you have something that can soothe you, that's nearby, keep that close to you. Remind yourself that people love you. Turn off your phone, or if you're not going to turn it off, maybe put it in airplane mode or do not disturb. Delete your ex's phone number.
I would say let the people who would be concerned if they didn't hear from you know that you're going to be unavailable for the next set of time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because because you may have a family member call right as you're peeking about wanting to talk about some emotional stuff, and you have to be like, now was not a good time.
Yeah, if you have a kid, like maybe get a sitter for your child and one for you. Like I think that there are ways to do this. Yeah, you want to just make sure that you're safe. If you're going to be in a very hot environment, make sure you have enough water. Likewise, there's also been some people that have suffered from drinking too much water because they got nervous about not having enough water. So put some electrolytes in your water. Make sure that you are just, maybe you have an accountability buddy that checks in with you and is like, you've actually had 2 liters of water and you're fine. Like you don't need additional things, just somebody who's can tell you that are you doing okay? I'm doing okay. It can be kind of hard to assess your own body because it's going to feel strange.
Well, and especially as you're new to this and finding your comfort and learning what you can and can't do, having someone there that is sober.
Absolutely. Having somebody there who's not just sober, but somebody that you genuinely do trust, because we've talked a little bit about suggestibility. Like if you end up doing this with somebody who would potentially take advantage of you in that environment, that's not safe either. So a trusted facilitator, and if not a facilitator, just somebody that, has your best interests at heart, can be with you, make sure that you're safe. If you have any sort of, I would say it's important to be able to differentiate between a medical emergency and a psychological emergency. Those things are very different and they might be responded to differently. Like I've seen people at festivals that clearly were undergoing a medical emergency and needed medical care. And I've also seen people at festivals that were in psychological crisis and, getting the police just bearing down on them and causing it to be far worse. So, that goes to set and setting. You want to make sure that you are being really careful and intentional about who you're going to have to interact with. Will that facilitator, if you are going to be outside, be able to prevent you from having to interact with any people? Can they kind of run interference and also make sure you're safe? So understanding what your social environment, what your risk is, what your comfort level is. For those who have a long relationship with psychedelics, maybe you'll be more comfortable doing something solo, but just being aware of what your risk tolerance is and what your dosage is going to be really important. And then just being really clear on what your boundaries are, negotiating them ahead of time. This is a huge one, and honestly one we probably should dedicate an entire podcast to.
Absolutely.
But just being really clear on what your boundaries are before you enter an altered state, and knowing that who is going to be either joining you in that state or watching over you in that state respects that those boundaries don't change once you enter that altered state, unless you can always say no, right? You can always
always make a more restrictive.
You can always make a more restrictive boundary. But if it comes to, a place where you might want to widen it, let's say beforehand you were saying, I don't want you to hug me at all. And then you get into the middle of your trip and you suddenly want that hug. It's going to be more important for that person to actually say, I'm not going to violate the boundary that we agreed upon because I want you to understand that in the long term, you are safe with me. And we can work through the feelings that are going to come up
Right. Yeah,
from,
and maybe they hand you a pillow or blanket to hug instead, or
yeah, yeah.
like that's also why I have my dogs that are trained, because if
Hmm.
someone wants contact or touch, it is safer to get that from a dog who is trained,
Yeah. And it's
potentially
easier to
than a human.
process.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's easier to process the feelings afterwards about how that felt. Like I felt alone. I felt, abandoned. And to be able to say, like, I'm so sorry that you had to go through that feeling that way. I want you to know that I was never abandoning you. I was making sure that I actually didn't, that I built the trust with you in the long term, that I would honor our agreements that we made, and that you can always re-enter a
Right.
psychedelic state later and be like, you know what, this time I want a hug.
Yes.
Or I want the option to have one, right?
Yes.
But you can't ever go back on getting out of an altered state and being like, we talked about this and you didn't listen. Like that, I really, really strongly believe that this is kind of like the important thing for whoever's going to be your trusted person in this scenario. So make sure you trust the people. Make sure you can have those conversations. If you can't have a conversation with the person that's sitting with you about boundaries,
Hmm.
they shouldn't be sitting with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No,
Um,
that's a hard
hard no. Yeah,
hard.
absolutely.
So ritual structure.
Yeah.
Churches or religions or faiths have a ritual structure that they engage in. And for some, it's more just partaking and being in a spot in nature. So, do you want to talk about the ritual
Yeah.
aspect of it?
I mean, a lot of places have like, different rituals that they use. And I think that this can be helpful to kind of look at your own history, right?
Hmm.
And use that potentially if there's certain ceremonies that you feel comfortable with. Being in a context that is not resonating with you might be pretty jarring. I think that,
Yes.
but it
No,
can
but
be.
I'll just say, like, there was, if you don't know what you're getting into, what you could experience might be very different from your comfort zone, what your beliefs are in alignment with, and it can be very eye-opening. And for me, like, that was a worthwhile part of the journey too. Was like, oh, this isn't for me. And sometimes it's not just finding what works for you; it's also finding what doesn't work for you.
Hmm.
So that context was helpful, because I am not one to be inside a building with a bunch of other people. I do want to have more of a individual experience with nature and be able to have that open communication versus something that is more rigid and structured.
It was a while ago, and I'd have to look into it. But what stuck with me is like there's this research that was done that's kind of saying that there's four Ds that can bring out the experience of transcendent awe.
Mhm.
And you'll see this a lot in various religious settings, but you also see it in raves. And that's
Yeah.
why, yeah. So it's drumming, that rhythmic drumming, dancing, moving
Mhm.
your body, sleep deprivation, and drugs. So those four Ds are oftentimes used to bring about these like religious transcendent experiences. Not to say that you have to have all of those or some of but these things can be tools in the belt to get there. Do you want to think about your ceremony format? What are you going to be comfortable with? What kind of music do you want to have on hand? Maybe you want to have a few different options because you might realize that something that you thought you were going to love when you get into the actual experience is way too intense for you. So maybe a few different options. Having control over the playlist, I personally love. I
No. Control? For Kelsey?
What are you trying to say, Jessa?
Nothing. I'll just let the
That's right.
audience infer.
Oh God. Anyway, you have you want to think about kind of your grounding rituals. Do you have any opening prayers or intentions that you want to set? Do you have integration practices planned for afterwards? Is it with a group or is it with alone? Just like making sure that you have kind of clarity around what your ritual structure looks like.
Mhm.
And even if you're a secular person and you don't think this like stuff makes you feel uncomfortable, that's totally normal. I think a lot of people have religious trauma and have experience where they feel weird about this, but your ritual doesn't have to be rooted in religiosity.
Mhm.
It can be something that is just intention setting. Like I am going to do this. And it does provide kind of like an end point and a starting point where you can feel like, okay, I've opened the container, I've opened the space, and now I'm closing the space. And that can be very helpful. We are humans. We are ritual people.
So before we dive into the integration, which you hit on a little bit, like the post-ceremony planning portion of it, is there any other like safety or contingency type planning that you want to include for the ceremony portion?
I mean, I think that we've touched on a lot of it, right? Like we've talked about making sure that you have an emergency plan in place, being able to tell the difference between medical and psychological challenges, you know, contraindications, not mixing substances that could interact in a dangerous way. So I think we've really I think that we've touched on it. Yeah, I think we can dive into post-ceremony stuff.
Bring it.
Well, I mean, these are my these are my favorite things. I don't love journaling, but I think it's helpful to integrate. For those of you who don't really know me, like I and Jessa, I'm the one who's always like, "Oh, that's okay. I don't have to talk about my feelings. Those are uncomfortable." So, this is when it's probably helpful to talk about your feelings. And you can talk with a trusted friend, or, if you are working with a guide, or a therapist, if you have one, and then really trying to kind of embody your lessons in your daily life. What kind of adjustments are you going to make in your life? You don't have to throw everything away. You don't have to be like, you know what, I'm moving to Italy, or like whatever it is that pops into your mind. They can be small adjustments. Maybe it's that I love my cup of coffee, but I think that I'm only going to have my first ritual cup, and I'm not going to have my third, fourth, fifth cup because I think that's not servicing me, or something like that. Not all changes have to be massive.
And I know this last bit that I just want to hit on before closing today, I think should be its own topic, but I think it's still worth at least highlighting the ethical and cultural responsibility as far as non-appropriation from indigenous or traditional practices. This is something I'm
Mm-hmm.
happy to jump in on, but if there's anything that you want to hit first as far as things that you would flag, like there's certain practices that are closed. And how do you engage with that? And, how do we walk in this space and just
Yeah.
recognizing we're both, of European descent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this is like, this is the hard part about, we're so globalized, and yet there's
Hmm.
still a history of certain peoples winning in that, like, winning
Hmm.
privileges. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all suffer as a result, but like, there's certain benefits that come from being part of kind of like the predominant colonial culture.
Right.
And at the same time, like this work, I really think psychedelics, I mean, they're connective work.
Hmm.
It's about connection. And we may all be earthlings, we may all be connected to this land, and here for a blip of time. Um, and we're all the same in that regard, but we're not all experiencing the world the same.
Hmm.
And I think that if your goal is connection with your fellow human beings, then considering how you engage with psychedelics, with entheogens, in a way that brings you closer in connection with your fellow human beings who might be experiencing the world in a different way, where they've been, systemically oppressed, genocided, the erasure of their families, their history, their ancestry. Like, having an awareness of that and not perpetuating that harm, I think philosophically really aligns with this type of work. And so, like, this is a really hairy subject. And I
Hmm.
think you're going to have people that have different opinions that change over time, and you're going to have a lot of conflict around this issue. And I think that a lot of times we try to, like, I guess, shy away from this, or become really entrenched in kind of like our belief system here. And I think that the only thing that I can offer here is to philosophically, like,
Hmm.
be open to changing your mind, be open to, um, you know, kind of being like, I feel differently about this now than I used to, and open to evolving. I think that that's from a European ancestry perspective. That's what I think I have to offer here.
I think I will bring in another word that you and I use frequently is one of reciprocity.
Yeah.
It's not just taking, it's not just seeking healing or peace or understanding or new perspectives, but it's also what are you giving back? Is it just witnessing? Is it understanding? Is it researching? Like what's making sure your sourcing is ethical, that it's not something that's been poached or endangered, like so there's lots of those, but it's the spirit in which you come at it with. It's not just being open, but it's also how do I give back as
Yeah,
much as I'm receiving? And also there just being an element of gratitude.
absolutely. Yeah. And I don't have like a really good, like, I don't have anything prescriptive. I think a lot of times this topic is brought up a lot in the psychedelic community, and there's not a lot of clarity around, like, well, what does being in right relationship actually look like in
Mhm.
practice? And I think in part that's because these relationships have been so broken.
Hmm.
And this is not the type of thing that gets solved in a single generation. So that's another thing, is to kind of keep a perspective that this is not solved by us. We can take a step, but ultimately we're probably not going to be here to see like everyone living in right relationship, or even most people living in right relationship with one another. All we can do is say, what am I doing?
Hmm.
What am I doing to try to heal some of these relationship wounds that have occurred across our species?
Well, Kelsey,
Yeah. I really appreciate everyone spending time with us. So thank you for spending this time with us.
absolutely. And if anything in here moved you, let it ripple. Share it, maybe even sit with it for a little bit, or use this podcast to spark conversations of your own.
And if it sparked your curiosity, subscribe to our Substack, where we will share links and sources to some of the cool things we've talked about today.
And also visit us at entheochurch.org. Until next time, take good care of your heart.
And your head.